At 0244, on a frozen February morning in 1943, the English Channel was less of a waterway and more of a dark, churning graveyard. The air temperature had plummeted well below freezing, turning the salt spray into jagged needles of ice that lashed against the exposed faces of the men aboard the HMS Prowler. This was a motor torpedo boat, a 70-foot sliver of mahogany and plywood designed for one thing: speed. But as the crew of the Prowler scanned the horizon, they knew a terrifying truth that the Admiralty in London refused to acknowledge. Their speed was a lie. On paper, the Prowler was a predator. In reality, it was a sitting duck. The boat was powered by 3 massive Packard V12 engines, marvels of American engineering that could churn out 1,200 horsepower each. They were the beating heart of the Royal Navy's coastal forces, capable of propelling these light craft across the waves at a staggering 38 knots. For the first few years of the war, 38 knots was enough to outrun almost anything the Germans could throw at them. But by the winter of 1943, the sky had changed. The Luftwaffe had introduced the Focke-Wulf 190, a fighter bomber so fast and so heavily armed that it turned the English Channel into a shooting gallery. The Focke-Wulfs didn't need to drop torpedoes or engage in complex maneuvers. They simply lined up behind the British boats and opened fire with 20mm cannons. To survive, a motor torpedo boat needed to hit 40 knots, but the Prowler was stuck at 38. It wasn't a limitation of the fuel or the propellers. It was a limitation of the mind. Inside every one of those Packard engines sat a sophisticated mechanical governor. It was a masterpiece of hydraulic precision, designed by the world's most elite engineers to ensure that the engines never exceeded 2,500 revolutions per minute. The governor was there for a very specific reason: to prevent a catastrophic manifold collapse. If the engine spun too fast, the internal pressures would become so violent that the V-12 would effectively turn itself into a shrapnel grenade, shredding the wooden hull and sending the crew to the bottom of the channel in seconds. The British Admiralty's top technical advisors were adamant. The 38-knot limit was a hard ceiling. To push past it was a death sentence. They would rather lose a boat to German fire than see it destroyed by its own engines. This was the status quo until the arrival of Arthur "Artie" Finch. Artie was 34 years old, a man with grease permanently etched into the lines of his palms, and a quiet, unassuming demeanor that led most officers to overlook him. Before the war, Artie wasn't an aeronautical engineer or a naval architect. He was a clockmaker from a small shop in East London. He spent his days listening to the rhythmic ticking of escapements and the delicate tension of mainsprings. To Artie, a machine wasn't a set of rigid blueprints or a list of safety protocols written by men in suits. To him, a machine was a conversation. It was a living thing that told you what it needed if you were patient enough to listen. When Artie was assigned to the HMS Prowler as a motor mechanic, he didn't see a glorious war machine. He saw an animal with a muzzle on its face. He watched from the engine hatch as his friends were buried at sea, their boats torn apart by Focke-Wulfs that were just 2 knots faster than they were. He saw the fear in the eyes of the young sub-lieutenants who knew their lives were being sacrificed for the sake of an engineering warranty. Artie spent his nights in the cramped, oil-slicked engine room of the Prowler, his fingers tracing the cold steel of the Packard governors. He realized that the engineers in London were right about one thing: the hydraulic governors were perfectly designed. But they were wrong about the engines. The Packards wanted to run. They had more to give, but the governor was cutting off their breath just as they were reaching their peak. If you've ever felt the frustration of knowing a solution is right in front of you while the experts tell you it's impossible, you'll understand why Artie did what he did next. If you want to see how a simple spool of wire changed the course of naval history and saved the lives of hundreds of sailors, make sure to hit that like button right now. Your support helps us bring these forgotten stories of wartime genius to light. Artie's plan was so simple, it was almost offensive to the professional engineers who inspected the fleet. He didn't ask for new parts. He didn't request a dry dock overhaul. Instead, he walked into a local communications depot and walked out with a heavy spool of high-tension telegraph wire. It was copper-clad steel, tough as a piano string and twice as stubborn. Back in the engine room, Artie began to work. He wasn't dismantling the governors, he was bypassing them. He rigged a series of what he called tension leashes. By looping the telegraph wire directly to the throttle butterflies and running it back to a manual lever near his station, he created a way to override the hydraulic pressure plates. To anyone else, it looked like a mess. It was a bird's nest of scrap wire, held together by sheer intuition and clockmaker's precision. When the base engineers saw it during a routine inspection, they didn't just mock Artie, they were horrified. They called it a suicide rig. They told Artie that the moment he pulled those wires, the manifold pressure would spike, the valves would float, and the entire engine room would become a furnace. They threatened him with a court-martial for sabotaging His Majesty's equipment. They laughed at the idea that a man who used to fix watches thought he knew more about internal combustion than the Packard Motor Car Company. Artie just nodded, tucked his pliers into his pocket, and waited for the night the rules would no longer matter. That night came on February 14th, 1943. The HMS Prowler was on a standard intercept mission off the coast of Cherbourg. The mission was supposed to be a quick hit-and-run against a German supply convoy, but the intelligence was wrong. The convoy wasn't just guarded by E-boats, it was being shadowed by 3 Focke-Wulf 190s equipped with underwing cannons. The moon was high, reflecting off the water and making the Prowler's wake look like a glowing white arrow pointing straight at them. The attack came without warning. The first scream of the Focke-Wulf engines echoed across the water, just seconds before the first shells hit. The Prowler's deck splintered as 20mm rounds chewed through the wood. The captain, Lieutenant Commander Silas Vance, slammed the throttles forward. The 3 Packards roared to life, their deep rhythmic thrumming vibrating through the very soles of the crew's boots. The needle on the bridge's speedometer climbed steadily. 30 knots, 34 knots, 38 knots. Then it stopped. The governors did exactly what they were designed to do. As the engines hit 2,500 RPM, the hydraulic plates shifted, bleeding off pressure and capping the power. The Prowler was flat out, its hull vibrating with the strain, but it was at its limit. Behind them, the German pilots saw the gap closing. To them, the British boat looked like it was standing still. They banked for a perfect strafing run, their tracers beginning to stitch a line across the water, creeping closer and closer to the Prowler's stern. Commander Vance looked down at the gauge, then through the small viewing port into the engine room. He saw Artie Finch standing there, his hand hovering over the telegraph wire lever. Artie's face was illuminated by the dull red glow of the instrument lights. He looked less like a mechanic and more like a man about to commit a crime. Vance knew the risks. He had heard the warnings about manifold collapse. He knew that if the engines blew, they would be dead in the water, easy prey for the next pass. But if they stayed at 38 knots, they were dead anyway. "Artie!" Vance screamed over the roar of the wind and the thunder of the cannons. "Give me everything! Now!" Artie didn't hesitate. He grabbed the lever and pulled. The telegraph wire went taut, bypassing the hydraulic governors and forcing the throttle butterflies wide open. What happened next defied every manual ever written by the Royal Navy. The engines didn't explode. They didn't seize. Instead, they changed their note. The deep thrumming transitioned into a high-pitched mechanical scream, a sound of pure, unbridled power that Artie had heard in his dreams. On the bridge, the speedometer needle didn't just move. It leaped. It swept past 38, past 40, and buried itself at 46 knots. The Prowler didn't just accelerate. It felt like it had been kicked by a giant. The bow lifted out of the water, the spray turning into a massive white wall that obscured the boat from the German pilots. The Focke-Wulfs, which had been perfectly lined up for the kill, suddenly saw their targets vanish. Their lead shot calculations, based on the known 38-knot limit of British boats, were now useless. Their shells splashed harmlessly into the empty wake hundreds of yards behind the Prowler. The German pilots were baffled. They dipped their wings, trying to adjust their speed, but they were struggling to track a ghost. At 46 knots, the Prowler was no longer a boat. It was a kinetic blur. The laws of naval architecture suggested that the wooden hull should have been shaking itself apart at that speed, but Artie's stupid wire was holding the conversation together. He was sensing the vibration through the wire, adjusting the tension by fractions of a millimeter, feeling the heat of the engines through his fingertips. He was playing the V-12s like a finely tuned instrument. This was the moment the Luftwaffe realized that the rules of the channel had been rewritten. The Predator was no longer the one with wings. The fastest thing on the water was a plywood boat rigged with a clockmaker's scrap wire. But as the Prowler vanished into the darkness, leaving the frustrated German pilots behind, a new battle was just beginning. Artie Finch had saved the boat, but he had also broken every regulation in the book. He had proven the experts wrong, and in the world of military bureaucracy, that was a far more dangerous act than facing a Focke-Wulf. As the Prowler limped back toward the English coast, the engine still glowing a dull, angry orange, Artie knew that the real fight for his suicide wire was only just beginning. The silence that followed the prowler's return to the stone docks of New Haven was more deafening than the roar of the engines had been. As the sun began to bleed over the horizon, casting a cold, gray light on the oil-slicked water, the mechanical toll of Artie Finch's desperation became visible. The mahogany hull, usually sleek and defiant, seemed to sag. The paint on the engine hatch hadn't just blistered, it had vaporized, leaving behind charred, blackened wood that smelled of scorched sugar and burnt rubber. Inside the engine room, the three Packard V12s were emitting a series of sharp, rhythmic pings, the sound of high-grade steel contracting as it cooled from temperatures it was never meant to reach. Artie stood in the center of that cramped, sweltering space, his lungs burning from the acrid fumes of vaporized coolant. He didn't look like a hero. He looked like a man who had just survived an explosion that was still waiting to happen. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the physical vibration that had worked its way into his bones during those 20 minutes of madness. Every time he closed his eyes, he could still feel the telegraph wire humming against his palm, a direct line into the screaming heart of the machines. He knew that the manifold pressure had reached 65 pounds per square inch, nearly double the safety limit. The cylinder heads, made of a specialized aluminum alloy, had been pushed so far past their thermal threshold that they had begun to glow a dull, translucent cherry red. He reached out and touched the telegraph wire. It was brittle now, the copper coating flaking off like dead skin. This was the suicide wire, and while it had saved them, it had also transformed the prowler into a mechanical anomaly. To the Admiralty inspectors who would arrive within the hour, this wasn't an innovation, it was evidence of a crime. In the rigid hierarchy of the Royal Navy, the technical manuals were not suggestions, they were the law. By bypassing the governors, Artie hadn't just saved the crew, he had effectively stolen £1 million worth of Crown property and pushed it to the brink of destruction. Outside on the dock, the mood was even darker. While the prowler had escaped, two other boats from the 15th Flotilla had not been so lucky. The HMS Kestrel and the HMS Vengeance had been intercepted just 10 miles to the east. Without Artie's wire, they had remained tethered to their 38-knot limit. Their captains had done everything by the book, following the maneuvers taught at the academy, keeping their engines within the green zone of the tachometers. And for their obedience, they were now resting on the seabed. 34 men were gone, turned into statistics because a group of engineers in a comfortable office in London believed that a safety governor was more important than a tactical advantage. This contrast burned in Artie's mind. He thought of Peter, the motor mechanic on the Kestrel, a 20-year-old kid who used to ask Artie for advice on how to keep his spark plugs clean. Peter had died with a manual in his hand, following the rules until the very end. Artie felt a cold, hard knot of anger tightening in his chest. He looked at the bird's nest of wire and pliers on his workbench. He realized that the war wasn't just being fought against the Germans. It was being fought against a mindset that valued the integrity of a machine over the lives of the men who operated it. If you've ever felt like the people in charge are more worried about the paperwork than the actual results, you're not alone. Artie Finch was about to face the full weight of that bureaucracy. If you want to see how he defended his stupid invention against the highest-ranking engineers in the Navy, drop a comment right now with the word engineer and let us know what you think about Artie's gamble. By WWII, the prowler was no longer a boat. It was a crime scene. Commander Reginald Sterling, a man whose uniform was as stiff as his opinions on naval engineering, stood on the deck with a clipboard. He didn't look at the bullet holes in the transom or the exhausted faces of the sailors. He looked directly into the engine hatch. Behind him stood two technical officers from the Packard representative office, men who looked at Artie's telegraph wire as if it were a poisonous snake. "Explain this, Finch," Sterling said, his voice like dry parchment. "You've bypassed the hydraulic interlocks. You've exceeded the maximum allowable RPM by over 20%. Do you have any idea what you've done to these manifolds? You've likely microfractured the entire block. This boat is a write-off." Artie didn't back down. He wiped a smear of grease across his forehead, leaving a dark streak. "I didn't write it off, sir. I brought it home. The Kestrel followed your RPM limits. Where is she now?" The silence that followed was icy. Sterling's face flushed a deep, indignant purple. To him, Artie's success was an insult. It suggested that a clockmaker with a pair of pliers knew something that the finest minds in the British military-industrial complex did not. But the problem for Sterling was that the evidence was undeniable. The prowler was here. It was scarred. It was scorched. But it was afloat. And more importantly, the intelligence reports were already trickling in from the French coast. The Luftwaffe's reaction was one of complete and utter confusion. In a small airfield near Cherbourg, Oberleutnant Hans Weber, the pilot of the lead Focke-Wulf that had engaged the Prowler, was being interrogated by his own superiors. Weber was an ace with 12 kills to his name. He was a man who understood the physics of the hunt. He had reported that his target, a standard British motor torpedo boat, had suddenly accelerated to a speed that was mathematically impossible. The German Abwehr, their military intelligence, was already spiraling into a panic. They didn't believe in suicide wires or clockmakers' intuition. They assumed the British had developed a new type of supercharger or a secret fuel additive. They began to divert resources, pulling specialized hunter-killer squads from other sectors of the channel to track down this ghost boat. To the Germans, the Prowler wasn't a mechanical fluke. It was a technological breakthrough that threatened their air superiority over the water. Back in the engine room, Artie was being ordered to remove the wire. "Return the engines to factory specifications immediately," Sterling commanded. "You are grounded until a full metallurgical analysis can be performed. You're lucky I'm not putting you in a cell right now, Finch." Artie watched as the technical officers began to snip away his tension leashes. He felt a sickening sense of dread. He knew that the Focke-Wulfs would be back. He knew that the Germans were already adapting, shifting their tactics to account for a boat that could hit 46 knots. If the Prowler went back out there with its governors restored, it wouldn't just be a sitting duck. It would be a target with a bullseye painted on its hull. The Germans would be looking for the fast boat, and when they found a slow one instead, they would tear it apart with twice the fury. But then, the turning point arrived, not from a commander or an engineer, but from a piece of paper. A high-priority dispatch arrived from the Admiralty's Secret Operations Branch. A German blockade runner, carrying vital components for the V2 rocket program, was scheduled to cross the channel under the cover of a massive air umbrella. The mission to intercept it was deemed suicidal by every captain in the flotilla. The convoy would be moving at 30 knots, guarded by E-boats and at least a dozen Focke-Wulfs. A standard motor torpedo boat wouldn't get within a mile of the target before being shredded. The dispatch had a handwritten note at the bottom, signed by a vice admiral who was known more for his pragmatism than his love for regulations. It read, "Send the boat that outran Weber, and tell the mechanic to bring more wire." The room went silent as Sterling read the order. He looked at Artie, then at the half-dismantled engines, and finally at the spool of telegraph wire sitting on the grease-stained workbench. The experts were being overruled by the reality of the war. They needed the speed. They needed the suicide wire. But as Artie picked up his pliers to begin re-rigging the engines, he knew the stakes had just been raised to an impossible level. The last run had pushed the engines to their limit. This next mission would require them to go even further, into a realm of heat and pressure where metal behaves like liquid, and a single missed heartbeat from a V-12 would mean total annihilation. Artie wasn't just fixing a boat anymore. He was preparing a funeral pyre, and he was the only one who knew how to keep the fire from consuming them all. The night of February 17, 1943, did not offer the mercy of a calm sea. As the HMS Prowler slipped its moorings at 22:14, the English Channel was a churning cauldron of black water and white foam. A force 7 gale was screaming in from the North Atlantic, tossing the 70-foot boat like a piece of driftwood. For Artie Finch, huddled in the claustrophobic heat of the engine room, the weather was the least of his concerns. He was listening to the 3 Packard V-12s, and they were telling him a story of exhaustion. The previous run had taken a toll that no maintenance log could fully capture. The valve springs, subjected to the incredible heat of the over-revved engines, had lost some of their temper. They were no longer snapping back with the crisp precision of a clockwork mechanism. They were becoming sluggish, a condition mechanics call valve float. If the valves stayed open a millisecond too long at high RPM, the pistons would strike them, turning the internal combustion chamber into a graveyard of twisted metal. Artie sat on his low stool, his boots braced against the vibrating deck plates. He had replaced the brittle telegraph wire with fresh strands, but he had doubled them this time, creating a reinforced harness that bypassed the hydraulic governors with even more direct authority. He had also done something the Packard engineers would have considered heresy. He had tightened the tension on the fuel-air mixture screws by hand, leaning out the engines to get a hotter, more explosive burn. It was a gamble that increased the risk of a melt-through, where the heat becomes so intense, it literally burns a hole through the top of the piston. But Artie knew that tonight, they weren't looking for longevity. They were looking for a miracle. The mission was to intercept the blockade runner, a heavily armored transport named the Hildegard. It was carrying the guidance gyroscopes for the V-2 rockets, technology that could change the face of the war if it reached the launch sites in occupied France. The Hildegard was surrounded by a phalanx of 6 E-boats and shadowed by a rotating squadron of Focke-Wulf 190s equipped with flares and searchlights. The British Admiralty had dubbed this a high-priority intercept, a polite way of saying that the Prowler and its crew were expected to be a sacrificial distraction. As the Prowler hit the open water, the mechanical reality of their situation began to deteriorate. The port engine started to develop a rhythmic skip, a misfire that vibrated through the hull like a heartbeat with a murmur. Artie pulled his stethoscope from his kit, a tool he had carried since his days in the clock shop, and pressed it against the engine block. Through the roar, he could hear the sound of oil struggling to reach the upper bearings. The high-speed run 48 hours prior had thinned the lubrication, and the metal was starting to scream. He reached for a can of heavy-duty castor oil, pouring it directly into the intake in a desperate attempt to coat the moving parts. The engine room filled with the thick, sweet smell of scorched oil, a scent that Artie knew would haunt him for the rest of his life if he survived the night. Inside Artie's mind, a different kind of pressure was building. He wasn't thinking about the war or the V-2 rockets. He was thinking about his father, the man who had taught him that a machine is only as good as the heart of the person who tends it. He remembered the old grandfather clocks in the shop, how they would lose time when the humidity changed, and how you had to feel the weight of the pendulum to set it right. He realized that he was doing the same thing here, in the middle of a gale, with German cannons waiting for them. He wasn't just a mechanic, he was a mediator between the laws of physics and the will to live. He felt a profound sense of loneliness. If the engines failed, it would be his fault. If they blew up, it would be his fault. The lives of the 12 men on deck were tethered to the tension of a piece of telegraph wire and the intuition of a man who used to fix watches. Commander Vance's voice crackled through the voice tube, sounding distant and distorted by the wind. "Artie, we've got contact. Radar shows the convoy at 4,000 yards. They've seen us. Flares are going up. Get ready for the wire." Artie looked at his hands. They were covered in a mixture of oil, grease, and blood from a knuckle he'd barked against a manifold. He gripped the lever. He could feel the Prowler beginning to zigzag, the hull slamming into the waves with enough force to rattle his teeth. Then came the sound he dreaded, the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of the German 20mm cannons. The E-boats had opened fire. The Prowler was being bracketed by tracers, long glowing fingers of green light reaching out through the darkness, searching for the mahogany hull. "Now, Artie, give me the ghost," Vance roared. Artie pulled the wire. The engines responded with a violent shudder. For a second, the port engine hesitated, the misfire turning into a sickening mechanical gagging sound. Artie's heart stopped. He didn't just pull the lever. He reached out and grabbed the raw telegraph wire with his bare hand, pulling it an extra quarter-inch to force the throttle butterflies into a vertical position they were never meant to hold. The heat from the wire bit into his palm, but he didn't let go. He became the governor. He became the link. The Prowler surged. The speedometer on the bridge swung past 40 knots, then 42, then 45. But this time, the boat wasn't handling the speed as well as before. The heavy seas were turning the 45-knot run into a series of terrifying leaps. The boat would launch off the crest of a wave, its propellers screaming in the thin air, and then crash back down into the trough with a bone-jarring impact that threatened to snap the keel. Every time they hit the water, the engines groaned under the sudden load, the telegraph wire humming like a guitar string under Artie's bleeding palm. Then, the situation shifted from dangerous to impossible. A searchlight from one of the E-boats locked onto them, a blinding pillar of white light that turned the spray into a wall of diamonds. Seconds later, the first Focke-Wulf dived. This wasn't a standard strafing run. The German pilot, likely briefed on the ghost boat, didn't aim for where the Prowler was. He aimed for where it would be if it were moving at 50 knots. He unleashed a saturation strafe, a curtain of fire designed to catch a high-speed target. A shell punched through the engine hatch, missing Artie's head by less than a foot and exploding against the bulkhead. Shrapnel sliced through the cooling lines of the center engine. A geyser of pressurized boiling water erupted, filling the engine room with a blinding fog of steam. Artie couldn't see the gauges. He couldn't see the engines. He was working in a whiteout of scalding vapor, guided only by the feel of the wire in his hand and the scream of the V-12s. "Artie, the center engine is smoking." Vance's voice was frantic now. "We're losing speed. We can't make the turn." Artie knew what had happened. The loss of coolant meant the center engine was minutes away from seizing. The pistons were already expanding, grinding against the cylinder walls. If he didn't back off, the engine would weld itself into a solid block of iron. But if he backed off, the Focke-Wulf would have them. He had to make a choice that no manual could guide him through. He had to decide which way to die. He wiped the steam from his eyes and looked at the telegraph wire. It was glowing. The friction and the heat from the engine block had turned the copper-clad steel into a heating element. His skin was blistering where he held it, but he didn't let go. He realized that the wire was no longer just a bypass. It was the only thing holding the boat together. The vibration was so intense that the mounting bolts of the engines were starting to shear off. The Packards were literally trying to jump out of their cradles. In that moment of absolute chaos, Artie felt a strange, calm clarity. He closed his eyes and listened to the scream of the engines. He could hear the center engine's cry for help, a high-pitched metallic wail. He began to pulse the wire, pulling and releasing in a rhythmic pattern that matched the pounding of the waves. He was giving the engine a second to breathe between the impacts, using the boat's own momentum to manage the heat. It was a technique that shouldn't have worked, a desperate improvisation that defied every law of thermodynamics. On the bridge, Vance watched the speedometer. It was fluctuating wildly, but the Prowler was staying above 40 knots. They were closing the gap on the Hildegard. The German blockade runner was looming large in the darkness, its own guns firing wildly at the white ghost that refused to sink. The E-boats were struggling to keep up in the heavy seas, their hulls not designed for this kind of high-speed pursuit in a gale. But then, the ultimate complication occurred. The telegraph wire, stressed by the heat, the tension, and Artie's manual pulsing, began to fray. One of the strands snapped with a sound like a pistol shot, the sharp end whipping across Artie's cheek. If the wire broke completely, the throttles would snap shut, the engines would stall, and the Prowler would be a dead weight in the middle of a German convoy. Artie looked at the fraying wire, then at the steam-filled room, and he did the only thing a clockmaker could do. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small length of silk cord he used for pendulum weights, and prepared to perform a mid-run repair on a machine that was currently melting. He was seconds away from the Hildegard, and seconds away from total mechanical failure. The climax of the suicide wire was no longer about speed. It was about whether a piece of silk and a bleeding hand could hold back the fury of 3,000 horsepower. At 23:51, on the night of February 17th, the HMS Prowler ceased to be a vessel of the Royal Navy and became a physical impossibility. Inside the engine room, Artie Finch was no longer breathing air. He was inhaling a toxic cocktail of atomized oil and high-pressure steam. The frayed telegraph wire was held together by nothing more than a desperate splice of silk cord and the sheer friction of Artie's gore-slicked fingers. He was braced between the port and center engines, his body acting as a human shock absorber for the violent tremors of 3,000 horsepower trying to tear themselves free from their mountings. The center engine's temperature gauge had long since pegged at its maximum of 240 degrees Fahrenheit. The smell was no longer just burnt oil. It was the scent of metal reaching its liquidous state, the very molecular bonds of the Packard V-12s beginning to fail. "Distance to target, 600 yards. Vance's voice came through the tube, barely audible over the mechanical shriek. "Artie, if she's got anything left, I need it for 10 more seconds. 10 seconds or we're all ghosts." Artie didn't respond with words. He couldn't. He simply leaned his entire body weight against the wire lever, feeling the silk cord stretch to its absolute limit. The manifold pressure surged to 72 pounds per square inch, a figure that would have made the Packard engineers in Detroit faint. The Prowler didn't just move, it shivered with a terrifying high-frequency vibration that threatened to turn the mahogany hull into toothpicks. On the bridge, the speedometer needle had swept off the scale entirely. Estimates later placed their speed at a staggering 48.7 knots. In the heavy gale-force swells, the boat was spending more time in the air than in the water. The German gunners aboard the Hildegard were paralyzed. They were trained to lead their targets based on a maximum speed of 35 knots. Even the most elite Focke-Wulf pilots were struggling to lead a target that was moving nearly 15 knots faster than the world's fastest naval interceptor. Tracers from the Hildegard's flak guns tore through the air, but they were consistently hundreds of feet behind the Prowler's transom. To the Germans, it looked like the British had developed some form of warp drive. The ghost boat was a blur of white spray and screaming metal, closing the distance at a rate of 82 feet per second. "Torpedoes! Laws!" Vance screamed. The two torpedoes splashed into the water, their own gyroscopes struggling to stabilize after being launched at such a violent velocity. The prowler immediately veered into a hard starboard turn, the hull leaning at an angle so steep the gunnels were underwater. This was the moment of maximum peril. The sudden shift in load put an unimaginable strain on the over-revved engines. With a sound like a cathedral bell cracking, the center engine finally gave up. A connecting rod snapped, punching through the side of the engine block and spraying white-hot oil across the compartment. Artie was thrown against the bulkhead as the engine room was plunged into a nightmare of fire and darkness. But he didn't let go of the wire for the remaining 2 engines. Even as the center V12 died in a heap of scrap metal, the port and starboard engines continued to scream, fueled by Artie's suicide bypass. Behind them, 2 massive explosions rocked the channel. The torpedoes had found their mark, striking the Hildegard squarely in the hold where the V2 components were stored. A secondary explosion followed, a pillar of orange flame that rose 500 feet into the rainy sky, illuminating the prowler as it streaked away into the night. The escape was a frantic 30-mile sprint on 2 dying engines. The Focke-Wulfs tried to follow, but the storm and the sheer speed of the initial run had given the prowler a lead they couldn't close before the British boat reached the protective umbrella of the shore batteries at New Haven. When the prowler finally hit the calm water of the harbor at 03:12, the engines didn't just stop, they seized. The moment Artie released the wire, the metal, finally cooling, contracted and locked tight. The silence that followed was absolute. Artie Finch crawled out of the engine hatch as the sun began to rise. His face was blackened, his hair was singed, and his right hand was a mess of raw, blistered skin where the telegraph wire had burned into his palm. He sat on the deck, shivering in the cold morning air, watching as the rest of the 15th Flotilla cheered their return. They had done the impossible. They had sunk the Hildegard, crippled the V2 program for months, and survived a gauntlet that should have killed them 10 times over. But the suicide wire had one final battle to fight. 2 weeks later, Artie was called before a formal board of inquiry at the Admiralty. The room was filled with men in gold braid and high-ranking engineers from the Ministry of Supply. They had the wreckage of the prowler's engines laid out on a table like an autopsy. They spoke of gross negligence, unauthorized modification, and the destruction of vital war material. They ignored the fact that the Hildegard was at the bottom of the sea. They focused on the broken connecting rod and the warped manifold. "You deliberately bypassed a safety system designed by the finest minds in the industry," a captain barked at Artie. "You destroyed 3 engines. How do you justify this, Mechanic Finch?" Artie stood there, his hands still wrapped in heavy bandages. He looked at the engineers, men who had never felt the spray of the channel or the scream of a Focke-Wulf on their tail. "I didn't destroy those engines, sir," Artie said quietly. "I used them. They were built to win a war, not to sit in a museum. If you want to court-martial me for bringing my crew home, then go ahead. But every man on that boat is alive today because of a piece of telegraph wire that cost the taxpayers 4 pence." The room stayed silent for a long time. The threat of a court-martial hung in the air, a final insult to a man who had redefined the limits of engineering. But then, a voice came from the back of the room. It was the Vice Admiral who had sent the handwritten dispatch. He walked forward, looked at the mangled engine block, and then looked at Artie. "The board will be dismissed," the Admiral said. "Mechanic Finch is to be returned to his unit, and as for the Finch bypass, I want it installed on every motor torpedo boat in the 15th Flotilla. We'll call it a standard field modification. That way the engineers can stop crying about their manuals." Artie Finch never received a medal for that night. There was no Victoria Cross for the man who broke the rules to save his friends. In the official history of the Royal Navy, the sinking of the Hildegard is listed as a tactical success achieved through superior speed, with no mention of the clockmaker or his wire. Artie returned to his shop after the war, disappearing back into the quiet world of ticking escapements and delicate springs. He rarely spoke of the prowler, and he never once complained about the scars on his hand. But the legacy of the suicide wire lived on. For the remainder of the war, German pilots reported a terrifying phenomenon in the English Channel. British boats that seemed to defy the laws of physics, moving at speeds that rendered their cannons useless. They called them the Ghosts, never knowing that the secret weapon they feared wasn't a new engine or a high-tech supercharger. It was the intuition of a man who looked at a machine and saw a conversation instead of a cage. Today, if you visit the Coastal Forces Museum, you might see a small corroded piece of copper-clad steel in a glass case. Most visitors walk past it, looking for the big guns or the torpedo tubes. There is no plaque explaining what it is. But for those who know the story, that piece of wire represents the moment when innovation moved faster than bureaucracy. It's a reminder that in the heat of battle, the most powerful tool isn't the one designed in a laboratory, but the one forged in the mind of a person who refuses to accept that impossible is the final word. Innovation isn't always about a billion-dollar budget or a team of scientists. Sometimes it's about a sergeant with a pair of pliers and the courage to pull the wire. If this story of Artie Finch and the ghost boat moved you, if you believe that the people on the front lines often know more than the people behind the desks, then hit that like button. Every like helps us keep these forgotten stories of human ingenuity alive. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into the hidden history of the machines that changed the world. And drop a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from, or share a story of a stupid fix that actually worked. You're not just a viewer, you're the guardian of these memories. This was the story of the suicide wire, the night the rules of engineering were broken to save the men who lived by them. Until next time, keep listening to the machines. They always have something to say.